A term that I learned when I was working at Microsoft and working in the US in general is that there's this term called Hippo, which is highest paid person's opinion, which is actually antithetical to data-driven decision making. My college essay to Stanford was about one day potentially contributing and working in Vietnam. And many times before that, the opportunities never aligned well. I always felt like I was giving up something or sacrificing something in my career. But with this opportunity, I felt like I was advancing myself. Frankly, Vietnam is more representative of the majority of the world than Silicon Valley is of the world. There's 6.5 billion people outside of the US and China. And they have very important businesses and very important use cases that need to be taken care of. I think a simple one, maybe a no-brainer, is that I think data infrastructure is not as mature as what maybe other countries have in terms of having a true data lake, a data warehouse, having it organized in such a way that every single person can look at the data and pull up reports and find relevant information for their fields. Not just the data engineers and the data scientists, but also the marketers, the BD folks, the sales folks. It's not as readily available as I think it should be. So I think data infrastructure is one area that's very important. Other one is a bit more subjective, but I do believe the education of data readiness, of having a data-driven mindset, is also a bit nascent, still in the early stages. So with kind of the use of AI and the advances of AI that's happening very quickly, the large frontier labs and large tech companies like Anthropic, like Google, OpenAI, they're going to continue to get bigger and larger, and they'll offer so many different tools and services. But I also think because it's so much easier now to build your own software, to build your own services, you're going to have a lot of these niche applications that happen on the other end of the barbell. Hi, I'm An Luong. I was born and raised in the US, moved to Vietnam about 5 years ago. My background's in data and AI with a focus on operations research and industrial engineering. My undergrad was in computer science at Stanford, and my grad was in data science at MIT. I started my career working in big tech at Microsoft, moved to Walmart Labs, and then worked at a startup in New York City called 𝗟𝘂𝘂cie. Like I said, I moved to Asia 5 years ago, drawn for both professional and personal reasons. Since I've been here, I've worked at some of the largest companies, which are like One Mountain Group and Masan Group, applying AI and ML at scale for millions of users. In doing so, I also had to build out some of the infrastructure, both organizationally as well as technically, to do that. I suppose I specifically chose to work at these companies because I do think the scale that they have already and kind of ready for me to kind of go and apply AI and ML was very, very exciting for me to do for a place that I have personal ties to. However, since then, I've been exploring the startup space, and I also find the startup space to be quite interesting and exciting too. Yes, so why Vietnam? It certainly wasn't an easy decision. It actually took me about 1.5 years from when I first spoke to the recruiter who told me about the opportunity in Vietnam to when I actually moved to Vietnam. So it was quite a long process. I'm sure she wasn't super happy about that, but it worked out really well. And I'm actually quite good friends with this person now. But pretty much why was it was two parts. One was professional and one was personal. On the professional front, it was for this company called One Mount that was building out the digital ecosystems within a few verticals in Vietnam that I found very exciting. It was backed by some of the largest conglomerates in the country, like Vingroup, Masan Group, as well as Techcombank, and it was very well funded. And so all those reasons were like, oh, and I also got to come in to lead a large data science branch of the company. And so for me, it was also a very unique opportunity at my age at the time to have such a large group and a large set of responsibilities. So that was a very exciting opportunity for me professionally. On the personal side, I've always been interested in working in Vietnam. My family's from Vietnam. I would grow up visiting the country a lot. And this was a chance for me to finally work and live in the country. Really, actually, another thing that maybe not many people know is actually my college essay to Stanford was about one day potentially contributing and working in Vietnam. And so, and many times before that, the opportunities never aligned well. I always felt like I was giving up something or sacrificing something in my career. But with this opportunity, I felt like I was advancing myself. I wasn't really giving up anything financially, and I was able to really kind of grow my career. And so it all fit out perfectly in many ways, professionally and personally, which is what brought me to Vietnam. Yeah, what are areas that I think are overlooked in Vietnam? Well, from my experience working at Vietnamese companies and working with Vietnamese companies, I think a simple one, maybe a no-brainer, is that I think data infrastructure is not as mature as what maybe other countries have in terms of having a true data lake, a data warehouse, having it organized in such a way that every single person can look at the data and pull up reports and find relevant information for their fields. Not just the data engineers and the data scientists, but also the marketers, the BD folks, the sales folks. It's not as readily available as I think it should be. So I think data infrastructure is one area that's very important. Other one is a bit more subjective, but I do believe the education of data readiness, of having a data-driven mindset, is also a bit nascent, still in the early stages. So having leaders truly believe and using data to make their decisions is something that is not quite there from what I've experienced, right? I think there are many data-driven leaders out there, but some folks that I've worked with, because they don't trust the data, because of part one, the data infrastructure, they always go back to their instinct, because like, oh, I don't trust the data, so I'm gonna make a decision based on what I know, because I'm a successful leader. And I understand that, right? If I was them, I'd probably feel the same way. But that's where you have to solve the first part of the data infrastructure to actually get to the second part. And of course, to get to the second part, you actually have to show value, and that's where the applied aspect of it comes in, which is what I was trying to show and do for the last few years in regards to overlooked and kind of important for organizations here. What opportunities exist, I think, outside of Silicon Valley, in countries like Vietnam and places like here? I think, frankly, Vietnam is more representative of the majority of the world than Silicon Valley is of the world. I think the Bay Area is extremely exciting. I went to school there, I have many friends there, my brother lives there. I go there all the time. But in many ways, it's a bit of a bubble. It has its own way of thinking that I think is super exciting and interesting for the world. But it's also sometimes is a bit not relevant for a lot of the world. And so my view is that part of the world is very important for developing the newest technologies and disrupting industries. But then after you disrupt these industries or build these technologies, you have to actually apply it for the rest of the world. There's 6.5 billion people outside of the US and China. And they have like very important businesses and very important use cases that need to be taken care of. And so I think the opportunities is the opportunity that exists for all those people. And I think that's an area of like taking that technology and localizing it and applying it appropriately for the different ecosystems that are out there outside of the Bay Area, I think is very important. And I think that's an opportunity to do in Vietnam, but also not just in Vietnam, but other parts of Asia, other parts of Europe, wherever in the world. It's essentially, how do you translate cutting edge research to actually work for the regular person that's not an engineer in Silicon Valley? Related to kind of using data to actually make decisions, a term that I learned when I was working at Microsoft and working in the US in general is that there's this term called Hippo, which is highest paid person's opinion, which is actually antithetical to data-driven decision-making. Because essentially, instead of relying on the data, relying on good ideas, where it can come from anywhere, some organizations essentially just default to the Hippo decision framework, which is whoever is the most senior person, they make the final call. I think that's antithetical, like I said, to data-driven decision-making. And I've seen that in many places I've worked, both in the US and in Vietnam. But in general, I do think maybe in Vietnam where the data is not as ready and not as truly applicable to many spaces, it ends up defaulting to Hippo. And I do hope that in the future, right, as the use of AI and data becomes more prevalent in every organization, not just tech organizations, right? But also organizations within HR, within manufacturing, then we start moving away from Hippo. And we start moving to the best idea and the idea that makes the most sense, that has the most data to back it. That's the hope, and I think it will eventually get there. I think that is just one area that I've seen a bit here, and I think it will change in the future. So for AI, what I have obviously a lot of views on its application, what we're viewing it, how we're overestimating or underestimating it. But one area that I've thought about more recently is kind of the view that AI is going to swallow SaaS, or software as a service. The death of SaaS, right? There are some articles written recently where it's like instead of SaaS, you'll have this new paradigm, which is also SaaS, but different S, which is services as a service. where the idea there is that instead of having like a software tool that you use for CRM or you use for managing accounts, et cetera, right? You'll provide services that do that full pipeline. So you're not subscribing to a software package like a Salesforce, but you're subscribing to the full service. I think what's going to happen there is going to be a bit, instead of like the full death of software as a service, I think you're going to have a bit of a more nuanced view. And actually, I kind of got to this view recently through a conversation with my good friends, Robert, about this, which is that, and I believe this is what may happen, is that we're going to have a bit of a barbell shape. And so with kind of the use of AI and the advances of AI that's happening very quickly, the large frontier labs and large tech companies like Anthropic, like Google, OpenAI, they're going to continue to get bigger and larger, and they'll offer so many different tools and services. But I also think because it's so much easier now to build your own software, to build your own services, you're going to have a lot of these niche applications that happen on the other end of the barbell. So for like, you'll have like a local company in Vietnam or Thailand that instead of subscribing to a SaaS, they'll just say, let me build it in-house, or let me build with someone locally here that can do it, that understands my language, that understands my needs. And that person or that company will actually build it for me. And I don't have to go for probably a cheaper price than having to buy a bunch of licenses from an American SaaS company that doesn't understand how to actually apply it to my needs. So you have like very niche applications that I think will kind of expand as like the right side of the barbell. And then you'll have these large companies that again will continue to expand and get even more powerful, which is the other end of the barbell. I think the middle ground, which is like the mid-stack SaaS that kind of like in the past existed because you couldn't build your own software very easily, but these companies in this, these other countries still needed these tools. I think they're gonna flatten by either getting acquired by these other companies or getting their business taken by the other side. That's my theory. We'll see what happens. This area changes very quickly. I think there's actually a lot of opportunity on the right side. So this relates back to, I think, opportunities in Vietnam and around the world, which is like building something that targets a very niche business, niche application. That part's very interesting. That's what I'm personally interested in at the moment right now too. One area or observation that I have related to the effect of AI on society, actually, that I think is maybe underestimated, is the speed of which it's improving and the speed of which it's advancing. I think by now, people are aware that it's a very significant technology shift and that it will affect most jobs, if not all jobs. But I don't think people will recognize how quickly it's progressing. I think, looking back, let's just say 6 months ago, the tools that we could use versus now, it's like night and day, and it's accelerating. So I think moving forward, like 3 months from now, we'll have tools that we didn't imagine that we had right now. And so I think this is an area that I don't think I have a solution or a view of how you would overcome it, but I do think the speed of which it's advancing is something that maybe not everyone's aware of unless you're really plugged in and like following the news. And I think the solution is I think people should be aware, right? Because I think whether you're actively involved in that space or whether your jobs will be affected by it, I think at least you should know what's happening as opposed to oblivious to it. And I think that's what everyone should be doing. That's what I'm doing. That's what my colleagues are doing. And I think that's very important.
This episode is brought to you by TechVibe, your one-stop IT recruitment solution provider. We connect global companies with top tech talent across Southeast Asia. Whether you're looking for permanent hires, short-term contractors, or employer of record, EOR services, we've got you covered, especially in the IT and digital sectors. Thanks for tuning in. And now, enjoy the episode.
Yeah, so for me, I chose to start my career working off in big tech as opposed to going straight into the startup world. But I do think this idea of like, where do you start? Do you start in an established environment or do you go to a more chaotic but more exciting startup world? That's a trade-off that I think many folks that I've talked to, whether they're younger or even older than me, that we always have a discussion on. I think it's very interesting. My own journey has been, I started off in the more established big tech environments and then have now more recently started in the startup space. And I kind of dabble between the two worlds because I think they're both interesting in their own right. But kind of what I've noticed and what I've seen in terms of advantages and the disadvantages for both, right, is it's because there's always pros and cons to each of these. In the big tech, big corp world, to starting it off, I think there's many advantages. First off is that you get really good at deep execution on a very niche field, because by definition, right, you're one of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. So then you're brought in for a very specific purpose and a very specific application, and you get very good at doing that because you have to be, right? That's why you're there. And I think that's something that is very good, right? In my space of data and AI and technology, you get very good at building models. You get very good at solving a particular problem. You get very good at optimizing, which I think if you are kind of a jack of all trades, you don't get that deep knowledge, which I think is important. You get very good at stakeholder management. You have to work with, again, by definition, so many people. So you have to make sure that you manage up, you manage down, you manage sideways, everything, right? And I think that is very important. I think even when you're in the startup world, because now you're managing your business partners and your clients and your suppliers, et cetera. In terms of starting it off in your early in your career, I think it's beneficial because you establish yourself reputationally. You have a known entity, a known brand on your resume that no one can take away from you. That clearly shows that you know what you are doing and that you could execute at a certain level in a place where the bar to enter is much higher. Because, right, anyone can be a CEO, anyone can be a CTO at their own startup, but it doesn't mean anything because there was no bar to entry. Anyone nowadays can just go on LinkedIn and just write that they're the CTO, right? And so I think having that established brand is very important early on in your career because then it gives you credibility that you don't get otherwise. Of course, it helps you financially set yourself up and have a good base so that you're not struggling in that area earlier on. Most importantly, I realized recently is that you actually have an amazing network of people who, like I said, again, had to all pass a relatively high bar to get into that organization, such that you're learning from the best. You're learning from leaders and directors and CVPs who like all are probably the best in their field. And from learning from them, you can kind of take that and apply it to your own space, whatever industry you're in, and hopefully do well in that area. I've seen that myself. The people I was lucky to work with at Microsoft are now doing amazing things in their careers that inspirational for me. Of course, on the startup side, I think there are unique advantages to that space too. Whether you're founding your own company or part of the early founding team, you are, by definition, a more important role in a smaller team. So you have to do more. You have to own more things. You have to learn more things. And if you don't do it, no one does it. So you're also given a lot of responsibility, and it teaches a radical sense of ownership that I think is missing a bit from if you're in a large organization. And frankly, I think your speed of learning and your speed of growth is probably faster than if you're at a large corporation. And I think that's also very unique to working in the startup world. Yeah, so that's kind of my view on, I guess, the corporate versus big tech versus startup discussion in that regard. So moving on, so like kind of the next areas that are interesting for me would be, I've been asked if I was to start my journey again, would I make the same decisions in terms of like organizations that I would join or the general path that I would take. And my view is that if this was 2015 or the mid 2010s, yes, I think I would take the same route because I do think I'm quite, I would say, happy, and I think the way I view my life is that you should not live with regrets. So I think the decisions I made were thought out, right? It took me a year and a half, for instance, to move to Vietnam. But I would say one caveat would be if it was right now and I was a recent graduate from college, I would do things slightly different, which is that I would time box my time in big tech to be actually shorter. Because I think right now the world is moving so quickly that you should optimize for learning as much as you can, as quickly as you can. So I think, and like I said, I think the startup world allows you to learn more quickly. And I think there's so much opportunity at this given moment that I would join like an early stage startup or build my own company earlier on as opposed to later on, which is I think maybe a slight nuanced change. So essentially just, I guess, compacting my current path a little bit more. I think I've also been asked like, what should I do, right? And I think I can't really answer that. I think it's a very context-based decision. I think the most important thing to realize is actually understanding your own appetite for risk. How happy are you to take risk, and how afraid of you are of taking risk? I think that is the most personal question that ultimately drives the answer to should you join a startup or big tech first. Some people hate taking risk. I think those people should stay in big tech their entire lives, because that's probably where they're going to thrive, and they'll actually fail and have a bad time in the startup world. Some people hate kind of steady and stable and just kind of like doing the same stuff over and over again. And so for them, the big tech world, I think, would also be a pretty bad experience. So for them, like you have all these serial entrepreneurs, right, that can't possibly work at a large company. They're constantly building their new thing. You kind of have to know that about yourself. And I think once you know that, then you can make the right decision. I think that's a very personal, context-specific question. Yeah, so thoughts or advice, I would say more like thoughts that I would give for folks who are younger or starting off in their careers would be kind of to make sure you're always developing yourself and learning. And what do I mean by developing yourself? I think the skills that one needs to succeed in the world we live in now is a bit different, and it's changing from maybe, let's say, 10, 15 years ago. Again, one of the themes of this conversation has been how important AI is and how fast it's progressing. But I do think there's like universal skills that will always be important, and I think especially important when now maybe more mechanical things, more technical things can be solved easily with AI. Right before, when I was in college, right, becoming a software engineer, learning how to code was very important. That's why I studied computer science, because I was like, oh, this is a very sought after skill that I should develop that is important for the future that I'm gonna be moving towards. But now, right, I think if you want to code, the barrier to entry is actually much, much lower. Anyone can code using any of these agents. So then I think the skills that you're developing now are, I think, more human. So the framework that I use is for oneself, right? The skills I think are most important is actually being creative and being able to solve problems that come your way, and also establishing your sense of taste and judgment. Knowing what is good, what is bad, what architecture, what design makes sense, and why it makes sense. Because I'm also seeing with more junior members that were on my team or that I hire, is that they kind of just give everything to 𝗟𝘂cije and they don't understand why it did what it did. When I ask them more deeply why they made this decision, they're like, oh, because the AI told me to. And so I think having a taste and understanding why is very important. And I think that's a skill that will be particularly important moving forward. The other human skill, human-related skill I think is important, is how you work with others, right? Because you can work with your agents, you can work with your AIs, but essentially in a world where humans are still kind of how you have to work with people to get things done. So I think the two other skills that I think are important really relates to how you work with others, which is, can you build trust and can you lead? And I think those are two very important skills that I think that one should develop as much as you can. And of course, right, it depends on your stage in career. If you're 21, leading will be a bit less natural because maybe the opportunities won't be there as much, but you could always lead others, right? You can mentor others. Essentially, it's like with any skill, you have to develop it. You can't just expect like, oh, I'm gonna go and like be an amazing leader, even though I've never done it before in my life. It's something that you have to kind of develop over time. Same as taste. You can't just come and say my taste is is amazing, even though you've had no experience making wrong choices or right choices. So I think those are the two areas, like the framework that I use to kind of develop, because this is what I try to do with myself, frankly. So that relates to kind of skills. Mindset-wise, what's helped me the most in my life has been, I think, two things. I'll just talk about two. Is that believing that there's always something that you can learn from others, right? Regardless of what role they have or what level they are. There's always something you can learn from your peers, from your team members, from your leaders. And so being humble enough to realize that, I think, is something that has served me well. And then also always having a mindset of continuously improving, right? I always believe that the version of me 1 year from now will be better and smarter than the version of myself right now. And it's a never-ending process until you die. And so I think that also has served me well in terms of just like understanding that there's always more to learn. And I think especially when you're younger, actually no, I think it's just evergreen. You should always have that mindset in my view. And then lastly, kind of what advice would I give my younger self? Well, first of all, I don't think I'm that old, but if I was looking at my younger self, I think I would tell myself to take more risks. Because again, back to the topic of like measuring your own risk tolerance, I think there's a variety of reasons that I made decisions that I've made up till now, and as it relates to risk. But what I've realized kind of progressing through my career is that, in my view, I've always made decisions with a margin of safety. A term that I kind of became familiar with reading, like kind of becoming more familiar with Warren Buffett's like view of value investing, where when you invest in something or make a decision, you should always have a margin of safety in case there are things that you can't take into account that happen. And so you should always have a margin of safety to be safe, to be okay. I've always viewed that like, oh, I want to always have a margin of safety in my career. And so I'm going to make certain decisions that generate more insurance for me, that allow me more optionality in my life. But I realized that you're never going to have enough optionality. You're never going to have enough insurance or enough margin of safety. And so you should go ahead and just take risks, because as you're taking those risks, as long as you're approaching it in the right way, you will gradually build your margin of safety. There's never a point where you'll have enough and then you could take a big swing, in my view, because by every action you make, you're kind of making a trade-off decision. So then why not just start taking risk earlier on? So I think that's kind of the advice I would give myself, and know that if you approach it the right way with a growth mindset, always wanting to learn, you'll be fine. Yeah, on the topic of reflection, right? One thing that I recently did, and I think is helpful as a framework to think about your past, but also your future, is kind of reflecting on who you were at a certain stage in your life and who you want to be in the future, at a future stage of your life. The way that I thought about it was like, take your age and then divide it by 2. And who were you at that age in your life? And then vice versa, or not vice versa, like kind of on the other hand, also take your age and then multiply it by 3/2. So if your age is n, do n divided by 2, what's your age? And then 3n divided by 2, what's your age then? And then versus, of course, n, which is your current age. So the reason why I think this is a helpful exercise or a framework that I use pretty much every year was that, you know, if I reflect on my own career, right, at n divided by 2 years old, I was quite young and not sure of what my future would look like. It was like before I knew which college I would be going to, what major I would be studying, what career I would have, how my life would look like, both personally and professionally. But I had goals, and I had these, I kind of visualized what I wanted. But even what I visualized at that age versus what I am now, I found that I've been very fortunate to kind of be in the space that I am at this moment, in terms of what schools I was able to go to, what jobs I was able to have, what experiences I got in these last, n by 2 years. And so it was just like when I reflect that n by 2, that person versus who I am now, would they be proud of me? And thankfully, I feel quite proud to be who I am. And so taking that same view, I was like, okay, then who do I want to be in 3/2 n years from now? What do I want my life to look like at that stage? And I think visualizing that and having specific goals, right, bullet points of what I want that to be, you know, whether that's a successful founder or a senior leader somewhere professionally, right? Or whether having a family, having X number of kids, you know, living in certain cities, doing certain things like working for certain nonprofits or volunteering. Those are all things that I find if you visualize it and have kind of like I wouldn't say a deadline, but a goal to work towards, it's very helpful. And I just think the age is a nice grounding metric that changes every year. So, you know, it's never done, and and it's always continuous. Right? Like if you're 100, what will you look like at 150 years old, right? You know, sometimes aspirational, but maybe, who knows? Maybe with new technologies now, you can live to 200 to how many years old. But I do think it's an aspirational thing that I use that you should do every year. That's helped me, and hopefully that's helpful for anyone watching this.